is actually the first time I've given a presentation in this format. I must have given absolutely hundreds of wildlife themed PowerPoints, but I'm always stood by the projector screen, often with the screen projecting straight into my face, and you then get the feedback with people in the room. So hopefully I'm just going to imagine you all nodding along and giggling at the right moments and finding the right bits entertaining. But it's very strange being sat here in my dining room speaking to 20 people dotted around the district, but I'm delighted to do so. And I was able to step in. It was due to be Sarah giving you a talk tonight, but I've stepped in to bring my talk forward, which was very easy to do. And so I've deliberately not covered any of the harvest mouse territory, because she is the absolute expert on that. And whilst I'm very lucky to work on a number of reserves where we've got good harvest mouse populations, I knew that one was coming up for you. So I've decided really to focus on several other species that I've been really fortunate enough to work with in my career in conservation. And some of them are pretty well known, but it's the sort of principle of the presentation very much is, if I were to go back to the 12-year-old me living in Cheddar and growing up on the Mendips, and say that I'd be able to enjoy a professional career which involved some of these animals, I would have just been absolutely giddy with excitement. And I always try and remember that whenever I'm at work, because obviously even in the fabulous world of Devon wildlife conservation, there are less than perfect days where you've got to plough your way through drudgery and admin, but on the whole, the good days are absolutely spectacular, and it's so important to have that underpinning of what's so important. So my career actually started in conservation proper with the Devon Wildlife Trust back in 2001, which is a staggeringly long time ago. Before that, I had a short time working as a press officer in North London, and that was enough to convince me that I did not want to work in industrial PR. I didn't want to live in London, and I really, really wanted to follow my lifelong interest in the natural world and nature. As I mentioned, I grew up in Cheddar and was very lucky that friends and neighbours just down the road were Mike Woods, who was the most incredible naturalist, wrote for the Financial Times and was heavily involved with his father, Doug, in the dormouse conservation that really sort of had its birth in the Mendip woodlands. And I got insight into that. His wife Frankie was my piano teacher, and so anytime I turned up early for my lessons each week, I'd either spend it staring at Mike's incredible collection of skulls and skins and just those things that make a naturalist tick, or if I was really lucky, Mike would be there and take me around to see the breeding dormice in his back garden. And so that was my first contact with dormice, and that's why I decided to get the talk started with this species, because it's one that I've known about since, well, I was about 11 years old, and used to, as I said, get introduced to them by Mike when I went to visit Frankie for piano. But also he took me up to Roundball Woods and showed me the box scheme, and it took me, let me see, about 26 years to get my dormouse license, which must become some kind of terrible record of general teenage lethargy and having lots of other plates spinning, and always being involved in dormouse box schemes, but never really taking that next step to getting the license and actually undertaking them myself until very, very recently. But there are species that I absolutely adore working with, and they're, as we know, heavily protected, and so hence you do actually need to have a specific license to be able to knowingly interact with them in any way. It is a crime to knowingly or recklessly disturb or damage the habitat of a dormouse. And yet with all that protection, they're still declining nationally at a frightening rate. And so we've been surveying for dormice in Coliford Woods, which is a beautiful woodland site just outside Seton. And in that woodland, we've had 50-box dormouse recording scheme for the past 18 years. And that was originally started by a local ecologist, Ian Crowe, who has subsequently gone on to be one of our site graziers with his fabulous Devon Ruby Red cattle, but more about that later. The scheme then lapsed for a short while, and when I got back to East Devon District Council as the sites team leader, after a short break between employment with the council to do some farming and work locally on other conservation projects, I got the dormouse box scheme re-established. But during that time, this area down here, which is about 12 hectares of what was conifer plantation that was clear felled in 2008, during that period up until 2016, so those 8 years, the scrub and birch and bramble had developed to such an extent that rather than having the 50-box scheme as part of the National Dormouse Monitoring Project, all in the same part of the woodlands that the original scheme was based around, we spread it between that part of the old ancient woodland and this new emerging fecal woodland that was sprouting up where the conifer used to grow. And it has been so interesting to actually be able to monitor the use of that really young woodland by the dormice. And far and away, it's the most busy area of the woods for dormice now that we've got, far outstripping the more mature woodland, or at least within the constraints of the dormouse monitoring box scheme. That's where we're getting the most activity. And I'll come on to a little bit more about that in due course. But we've got these boxes, which are, here's one being checked by my younger daughter, Bethany, who is out with me a couple of times a year just to help investigate. And seeing as I was a similar sort of age when Mike Woods took me around to see the boxes behind my house in Cheddar, I really thought it's a lovely thing to be able to introduce younger people to. And it's a frustration of mine that the strict protections surrounding dormice stop me from being able to take school groups out on these sort of trips. And speaking from personal experience, I think the risks of young people learning more about dormice and then deliberately disturbing them are far less than the risks of young people never experiencing what a dormouse is, learning to love it and following a career in conservation as I did. So where possible, where they can be bona fide trainees, I'll get as many people involved in this scheme as I can. And that's a sort of mentality, an outlook that I've very much taken from Adrian Bailey, who I've done lots of my dormouse work with. And in fact, the other photo there on the right of the screen is Adrian's finger with a pygmy shrew about to take a large chunk out of it. And as well as the dormice in the boxes, we get a host of woodland mammals using it, even brown long-eared bats we've had in there in the past, and even toads climbing up and using these boxes to just sort of shelter in. The boxes are placed at about 4 feet above the woodland floor and hung from a variety of different tree species to give some kind of distribution through the woodland rather than always targeting certain species of tree. But then those results at the end of each year fed through to Natural England, updated to People's Trust for Endangered Species that coordinate the entire scheme. And we then get a comparable year-on-year record of dormouse numbers, as well as other errant species that clamber in. And the good news for Coliford is despite there being very, very steep declines nationally of dormice, in Holiford Woods, the dormouse population is stable. And in fact, we recorded our greatest number of mice in the 50-box scheme ever back in 2020, which was only 10 animals in the 1 month of May, which doesn't seem a lot, but quite frequently in a month's survey, you'll get maybe one or none. So to have 10, which included a female with young, was really exciting. And the vast majority of those animals were in the boxes we put up around the bramble and the scrubby area, rather than the mature woodland. Now, as I said, those boxes are placed for ease of monitoring at human chest height. And the thing with the mature woodland is that the dormice do not spend their time exploring the woodland at human chest height. So they're not looking to roost all the way down there. They're very, very arboreal in their habits. They very seldomly come down to the woodland floor. They do sometimes, but they prefer to move around in the canopy. And so if that canopy is 40 feet up in the air, that's where they're all going to be. So quite a lot of the time, because they are so hard to identify as being in an area, originally it was wild clematis, old man's beard bark stripping that you'd have to look for to see them using that material to build their nests. Then it was observed that they opened hazelnuts in a very characteristic way, so you could look for those. Increasingly, grey squirrels seem to be stealing the glut of hazelnuts earlier and earlier in the year, so the dormice are getting less to go at, and so those signs of habitation are dropping. And so it's these box schemes that really do provide, and tubes provide, that idea of population size. And somehow we need to be creative and try and survey higher up, because I think that will give us a better all-round picture of population scale. And of course, in Holiford Woods, it's a good example of that in action, because in the scrubby area, that dormouse activity is suddenly down around where we put the boxes, because that's where the food items are. There's a thick canopy, this time of bramble rather than oak leaves or ash leaves. And the dormice are doing really well in there, feeding on the fruit in the summer, and the plethora of aphids that are in there as well. Dormice have a really Catholic diet. They do not have the ability to digest cellulose in the way that wood mice and other rodents can. And so their food items have to be very high in fats or sugars to give them enough energy. They cannot digest that tough cell wall of most plant material and get to the energy in there. And so they're focusing on nuts, fruit, but a very high proportion of small invertebrates as well. So they're more like a shrew in their feeding behavior almost than a rodent. But that all comes from their internal anatomy. They're missing a part of the gut known as the cecum, which is what other rodents use to hold the bacteria that breaks down that cellulose. So that one little twist of physiological fate, and here we have an animal that has a very particular diet and therefore has to have this wonderful long hibernation, which they're in currently, because all of those low starch, high sugar and fat food items and all those insects are almost impossible to find. So they put on fat, they can increase their body mass to 30-35 grams, and then they just sleep all the way through from October through till sometimes as late as April. But increasingly we're finding them active earlier than that as the climate warms. So they're going to be a very important species for monitoring for climate change as well. So that was a little bit about dormice in the early years. Then moving on to Seton Marshes, which is and the Seton Wetlands Complex, which is the site that I've been involved with since its very beginning. I was press officer for Devon Wildlife Trust, as I said, back in 2001, and used to write for the county magazine, which is now folded, which wasn't my fault, I promise, but that was called Devon Today. I now write for Devon Life as a twist of fate, but back then I was writing an article for Devon Wildlife Trust that appeared in Devon Today. And I got a phone call from Fraser Rush, who had just left the trust about 6 months before I joined. And he had read one of my articles and wondered if I'd pop down and write one about a new wetland site that he was working on down in East Devon. And I'd never been east of Branscombe before then. I was quite new to the county. And so I ventured down full of trepidation, and we went for a walk out over Coliford Common and Seton Marshes, which were the two wetland areas that East Devon District Council owned and whose grazing tenancies had just come to an end. And rather than bring a new farmer on board and re-let them, the countryside officer, as was then Jeff Jones, decided that these would make absolutely perfect local nature reserves. And so the designation was put on. Fraser was employed to be nature reserve officer, and I came along to write a little article about it. And I didn't know that 2 years later, in 2003, I'd be employed by Fraser and my now manager, Charlie Plowden, who took over from Jeff, to be the education ranger. And so from my earliest days of actually being out on the ground and freed from being behind the laptop or the PC monitor as it was then, and I was actually taking school groups and adults out onto the reserves to interact and to discover the wildlife. And it really was the culmination of everything that I'd been working towards. It was what I did as a hobby out of work, and suddenly it was what I was being asked to do in work as well. And as things developed and the popularity of the site grew, so the backing from the council grew, and the development has got to the stage that you see in front of you. So just working from the right of the screen back to the left actually takes us south to north geographically, and everything that's slightly darker on the illustration is land that we have ownership of and have some kind of either public access or wildlife improvements for. And so that first parcel with the sort of S-shaped ditch running through it is Sheep's Marsh, which is about to have an intertidal project come to fruition this summer on that. Then we've got the Seton Marshes Local Nature Reserve, which is a sort of horseshoe around Seton water treatment plants. So often it's the less glamorous parts of the town that find the best wildlife, and that's certainly a case in point. Then there's a large area of land in private ownership called Whitecross Farm. And then you come to Blackhole Marsh, which is that large intertidal lagoon, which has created so much of the real birding and bird foraging interest. And that's got 3 bird watching viewpoints around it, 2 bird hides, one of which is in the very center of the lagoon, and it offers such amazing views of birds really up close. And then we've got Stafford Marsh, which is the next area, and that's where most of our engagement facilities have been delivered and planned in. Before then, you get to Coliford Common, which is a natural salt marsh, thanks to a bridge through the sea wall, bringing big tidal inlets on the highest spring tides, which sees grey mullet cruising over the grass where 2 hours before the cattle might have been grazing. So it's a fabulous site, and anyone who's been there will know its value. But some of the real highlights for me have come in the increase in bird numbers that's taken place over the last 10, 15 years as the site has grown and become used more by the birds for foraging. And so habitat improvements, particularly Blackhole Marsh, has benefited black-tailed godwit, which used to be a pretty scarce bird in summer months. We had good numbers in the winter on the estuary, but in the summer that would really abate. And in the 2008 count, in the entire month of August, 40 birds were counted. Compare that to 11 years later in the 2019 data, where on one day, 66 birds were on Blackhole Marsh feeding on August the 8th. So a significant increase. And then those numbers grow even more into the winter when we get the breeding birds coming back from their summer grounds. Red shank, on the other hand, is a bird that up until the early 2000s was breeding on the Axe Estuary, and that is a real target for us to try and get them back as a breeding bird. We're hopeful this spring that there could be some breeding behaviour going on, but it's early days, and as yet there hasn't been any confirmed breeding in recent years, which is tragic for such a fabulous wetland bird. But in terms of numbers using the estuary, again in that sort of peak, late summer period, early autumn for the birds, August 2008, the entire estuary through that month was calculated as having 49 birds, whereas roll on 11 years, and on one day, the same day, there were 75 just feeding out on Blackhole Marsh. And it's hardly surprising. Blackhole Marsh is a 12-hectare intertidal lagoon with a completely unique way of working, which puzzles a lot of people, and there's a lot of conjecture about where it should be height-wise and salinity-wise and on the daily schedule. But what it's doing is creating big feeding opportunities with a heavy load of small invertebrates in the water and in the mud that these wading birds are feeding on. And it's not a habitat that would exist naturally because it's perched higher than the estuary. It means that only a really big tide, a 3.8, will actually fill it. So it doesn't have a daily tidal rise and fall as we'll do down at Sheep's Marsh, but it has this 2-weekly increase and decrease in water levels, and those are all controlled with a sluice and a very special tidal gate. One of the animals down at the wetlands that I've had a lot to do with are water voles, and we had a reintroduction attempt back in 2005 that was led by Mervyn Newman, who also worked at the Wildlife Trust as head of the Record Centre while I was there, and is an absolutely fanatical mammologist. He did some amazing work in East Devon, bringing waterfoals back, creating networks of mink monitoring volunteers and a raft system. But sadly, the methodology back at that time was so intense, so labour intense, that once Mervyn's contract came to an end and he moved on to his next venture, there was no capacity to maintain the level of vigilance needed to protect the voles. And so their numbers slowly declined, well, quite quickly declined. So when I came back to the Countryside Team in 2016, the counts on the Axe were virtually nil. They were effectively extinct again. And so I worked with Derek Gow, who's been very involved in watervole reintroductions and more recently beaver reintroductions, to try and explore different ways of protecting the water voles from mink. And technology has moved on, and what we were able to do was drastically reduce the number of the observation points where we're looking for these small mammals, which means that one officer, and it was myself, could monitor the entire area of the wetlands and ensure that the mink weren't coming back in and predating the voles. Now, the problem with mink, and in their North American native distribution, they're an animal that I admire absolutely hugely. They are an incredible predator, and they are incredibly intelligent. They are a very beautiful animal. There's no two ways about it. But in this country, their pressure that they can apply to water voles in particular, but also a lot of riparian birds and mammals, is just so great. Water voles have got loads of natural predators. Herons will have them, foxes will have them, weasels will have them, otters will eat them if they come across them. But the difference with mink and all those other predators is that the water vole has always got one escape mechanism up its sleeve to avoid predation. It often doesn't, and when we did the reintroduction of the water voles, the first photo of one of those newly introduced water voles was hanging from the beak of a heron as it flew off to eat it from a local photographer. But that's nature, and that's why we create nature reserves, to let those natural processes happen. What the mink do, though, is that they can follow them in the water and swim quicker. They can follow them over the land and run faster. And most importantly, the females can follow them down into the breeding burrows and completely wipe out the breeding population. And water voles are the classic boom and bust small mammal, where they will have 3 or 4 litters through the summer months. And the population grows very, very quickly. The earliest young will be breeding by the end of the summer, and so their population explodes. But then over the winter, they undergo a die-off, natural die-off of up to 70% of the population. So if you've got 100 voles on a stretch of river, come the following March, April, when they're getting ready to breed again, there's only 30 to start from. So any additional predation in those burrows is just, well, that's what results in the disappearance of water voles. And Devon was the first county to record breeding mink in the wild in 1952, and on the Tean Valley. And uncoincidentally, it was also the first county in Britain to record the complete removal of water voles. So the biggest vector in removing the mink has actually been the return of otters. I take some credit for coming up with a new monitoring and management technique with Derek that's managed to survey that area, but actually the correlation between daily otter sightings and footprints on the wetlands and very, very little mink activity at all is perfect with the return of those otters. And it's true that when otters are sprinting and using an area as a territory, mink will move somewhere else, because if an otter comes across a mink in its territory, it will kill it straight away. It's a much larger, more powerful animal, and they don't tolerate any cohabitation. So nature doing its thing here and righting a wrong that was of man-made cause. And so we've got we've got water voles now overwintering. We reintroduced them by 2017. It was deemed that conditions were favourable, and rather than having lots and lots of manually monitored mink rafts, we've used a technique and adopted it from the BASC guidance, and actually have automatic monitoring devices on the rafts, which tell us exactly when a mink is in the area, and those can be on passively the whole time, whereas before you'd have to wait to see mink footprints on a muddy platform, swap that out for a trap, and then hope that the mink was still in the area, which so often it wasn't, it had moved on. So hopefully, I'm hoping this summer we'll have another bumpy year, and then over the course of the next couple of years, we'll be working with neighbours and landowners running along the river system to roll out that mink monitoring further along and try and encourage the water voles to re-establish colonies and locations that were vacated decades ago. Another couple of successes on the wetlands this last summer, so 2021, we had first record of breeding lesser whitethroat, which is the bird on the top of the picture, in a field at the north end of Coliford Common, which is really scrubby. I got in a lot of trouble with the RPA when they came to do an inspection of our stewardship, ironically, and they didn't like it because their guidelines are anti-scrub. And I'm afraid, as someone tasked with managing nature reserves, I love scrub. I love scrub for its dormouse value. I love scrub for its nesting value. And so we had to agree to disagree on that occasion, because lesser whitethroat, our ringing group caught what looked to be a young adult back in the late spring, early summer this year. But when they were ringing it, they obviously had a close check for an age, and it was a newly fledged individual. So that was proof that it had bred very nearby, which was really exciting. We've also had swifts breeding on site in a man-made swift tower for the first time ever last summer, and that was after 4 years of me trying various different techniques to try and encourage them to spot the tower in the first place, and playing almost like Apocalypse Now, Flight of the Valkyries out of the helicopters. I was playing loudspeaker swift calls through the early summer just to sort of try and tempt them down out of the skies. And over the course of 3 years, where the first year they sort of flew past and took a passing interest in it, second year they were going in and out of the boxes but didn't bother breeding, and then last year was the third year and they bred. Unknown how many chicks were fledged, because we don't have CCTV in those boxes, frustratingly. It's something I'm working on, but they were regularly coming in and out through every day last summer. So that was a good sign that they were not wasting their energy on anything. And finally, stonechat were breeding up in the same area as the lesser whitethroat. This is the bird I'm hoping will breed this summer, because the huge sand martin cliff that was constructed in Stafford Marsh above a big pond has been getting increasingly noticed by the local sand martins, culminating last spring in April when we had quite a big flood event on the river, and it obviously flooded out a lot of the natural breeding sites of the sand martins further up on the Axe and the Collie. And by playing out calls of sand martins, they were coming in and for the first time going in and out of the artificial burrows. No breeding last year, but I'm hoping that some of those birds that did so much investigating this year will be back, last year rather, will be back this year to take up residence, because as much as it's fabulous, we've got a really solid population of sand martins locally. They're doing pretty well. They are in terrible peril with their natural breeding sites. And so if we can provide them with a slightly second best man-made alternative, but which is 100% safe and secure from predation and from flooding, then that gives them a certainty. So finally, a quick run through a new arrival, certainly in my lifetime, to Devon's biodiversity list, and certainly it's a mammal that Devon Wildlife Trust have been pivotal in the success of its reintroduction. I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with the story that 6-7 years ago now, beavers were recognised as breeding and being at large on the River Otter, when there was photographs and video evidence came to light. And the initial knee-jerk reaction of a lot of the authorities was that this needed to be rectified for disease, whatever reasons. The animals should be rounded up and put back into captivity where they belong. And such was the outcry from local people, from the schools, the Ottery St Mary Beaver Group, I remember vividly, did an amazing poster imploring people to see sense and give things a chance. And Devon Wildlife Trust came forward with the very sensible plans to actually monitor and get some of the data and the facts before decisions were made. And politicians saw sense. And so a formal 5-year trial was conducted in partnership with Exeter University. And by the end of that, the beaver handbook was written, which gives really good case study evidence of how any negative impacts from a beaver can be managed by a landowner, and so we can learn to live alongside them. And I had absolutely nothing to do with any of that. I was just giving some sort of context, and I'm not looking to take any credit myself for that. It was brilliant that it was happening, but then suddenly last summer, well, autumn really, it was September, October, someone posted a picture on the Honiton Facebook group of some vandalism that had taken place in the community orchard, and as are often blamed, some youths had been hatcheting down one of the little apple saplings. And Jake Chant, who's Devon Wildlife Trust's beaver officer, and myself, being alerted to it from our social media channels, both visited that apple sapling at different times and spotted that it was very obviously the work of a beaver. And with Jake's expertise, he surveyed the Gisage, which is a tributary of the River Otter that runs through Honiton, and confirmed that there was a resident beaver that had been there for at least a year prior to that, if not two, and was very much establishing his territory there, and was probably going to breed this year if a mate was found, and next year at the very latest. And so Jake and I did a lot of work, and I'm carrying on a lot of the monitoring to actually assess how this urban beaver is getting on. And there's the map of the otter catchment, and it is the middle jade green spot that is the River Gisage animal, and you can see the course of the Gisage goes up to its source at Farway, which is a very, very short hop across the watershed into the catchment of the Sid and the catchment of the Collie, which is the Axe. And seeing as Devon Wildlife Trust proved the case for beaver, and basically insisted that the policy now is that natural recolonisation is absolutely tolerable, then as soon as they make their way over into those catchments, the beavers will be back, and they are spreading at a rate. This is us out with Jake on the right hand side there, visiting some of the beaver territories that form part of a training day that Jake provided. And the reason why I've included this picture is because some of the fears that I've heard voiced from residents concerned about what it's going to mean to have beavers on the river, and more specifically in a town setting like Honiton, is that if you've got beavers that fell trees and eat bark and build dams, then you don't have trees. And this photo really vividly illustrates how untrue that is. This is a wetland system on the catchment of the River Tail, not far from Escott, and beavers have been living here at large for a very long time, certainly longer than the official study on the otter was conducted. And as you can see from that photo, there are trees everywhere. There are big trees, there is a lot of scrub, and there's a lot of this regrowing willow. And part of the work that we've got to do collectively now to help people come to terms with what beavers on rivers means in reality is illustrating and explaining how our aesthetic appreciation of trees around rivers will need to have a little adjustment, because the beavers are going to be cropping them and pollarding them to create vigorous new growth like this little willow sapling to feed on that. So if there are big trees that have sentimental value or ecological value or any value that we want to maintain, there are ways of protecting those trees, and other trees will get felled to provide food for the beavers and to increase the habitat complexity around our rivers, which is no bad thing, letting more light in, more plant growth, more stable riverbanks and things. So it's a very exciting point in time to be working in East Devon with this massive mammal back in territories that it had vacated due to human persecution. This is up at Otterhead Lakes, where there's been a breeding pair for the entire life of the 5-year study. And so these animals have been very, very closely monitored. And this is a really good site because it's somewhere with full public access. There's a little car park and lots of good quality footpaths around it. So you can actually encourage people to go and visit and to experience what a beaver woodland looks like. And despite Otterhead Lakes originally being a completely man-made site of reservoirs, it is such a natural feel when you're in there. And the damming activity, creating the wider pools and the wet boggy areas, just makes such perfect sense when you see it in context. And I can fully understand why it sounds frightening when it's sort of a concept just in your head. So it's by getting out, it's by experiencing these things that suddenly you realize where they fit in and what part of the landscape is missing because they are. And case in point is here. This is the largest beaver dam in Devon currently known, and the Google Maps screenshot gives away exactly where it is. It's down on the Budley Brook, so not far from Otterton. And running at right angles, it's much easier to explain this when I'm in the flesh, but you can see that there are beavers in there because if you look closely, you can see some of the birch trees lying down, and those have all been felled by the beaver. And the dam is actually an S-shaped line running at 90 degrees to the Budley Brook and holding all that darker area of water behind it. And it's absolutely huge, and it's completely vegetated and grown in. So it just looks like an old sort of remnant hedge bank if you just stumble across it. But such is the power of these animals that their impacts and their behavior is being visible from space already. So it is, as I said, very exciting. But there's loads to be done with those animals in the coming months and years. And it will be so interesting to see how our river systems develop with a natural landscape architect back in the driving seat, as it were. So I've rather gone on quite a long time, but if there are any questions, I will happily take them. Nope.
Hello, James. Sorry.
Hello. That's okay.
Thank you very much for that. Gosh, what responsibilities you have bringing back these animals from the brink. Touch and go. Can I ask you, as East Devon Countryside Manager, what do you manage?
Well, direct responsibility are the 10 local nature reserves across the district. So we've got some heathland. Yes, we've got heathland, woodland, wetlands, some intertidal down at Exmouth on the estuary, and some of them are high intensive, very active management, especially around the woodlands, looking to ensure that there's good habitat structure, creating areas of regenerating scrub, which is so fabulous. Others are completely hands-off, so the management is purely interpretive or engagement, and that's the bit which makes it the local government relevance. Because local nature reserves are spaces close to people for people to enjoy nature. So they're not a park because it's about the nature, but also they're not a national nature reserve or a NGO nature reserve because it's specifically about people enjoying it. So hence at Seton Wetlands, we've got those bird hides put in that maybe Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust wouldn't go for because they are maybe imposing on the landscape a bit more than they'd be comfortable with. So I'm always looking, as a naturalist, I'm instinctively always looking for increased biodiversity and better conservation gains. But equally, I've got to be mindful that it's got to have that accessibility and relevance and an enjoyment factor for people. So, you know, seeing young people learning how to ride their bike for the first time, little 4 and 5 year olds down on the cycle path at Seton, is as relevant to that place working for its brief as someone spotting their first ever, I don't know, osprey in the autumn. Yeah. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but it's a fabulous one to be tasked with.
Right, thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you. I know as a grandparent, our little ones love Seton Marshes. It's very accessible for them, very Excellent. Enjoyable. Thank you. I'll just go to the chat and ask questions on others' behalf. Thank you, James. So I'll just start off with Kate and Andrew. We found remnants of rodent nests in forks of camellia branches. Is that likely to be a dormouse?
In this part of the world, possibly. Elsewhere in the country, you'd probably say no. But I found dormice nests for hibernation actually in the roots of rhododendron when we've been removing those for heathland work. So they're not object to going into those very sort of tannin-rich evergreen shrubs and using the physical structure, even though there might not be any other food source or any other habitat resource to make use of. And we are lucky in this country, in this county, and particularly East Devon, that dormice populations are pretty strong. And so, whereas elsewhere it might be the last animal you consider, if it's a tightly woven nest with a good structure and it's larger than a tennis ball, I'd say very probably a dormouse. And if it's smaller than that and there's good grass to be had nearby, then it's probably a harvest mouse.
Thank you. So check out the nest structure.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Sarah has asked, James, how do you keep the sand martin bank predator free? And would mink take them if they could?
Yeah, I mean, mink are so opportunistic, they'd take anything if they could, and they'd just about squeeze down one of the sand martin holes. What we do is we keep the area directly in front of the cliff free of vegetation, because the accepted method is that if you had land-living predators such as weasels or indeed mink, they could climb into soft rush or reed mace or something and literally snatch young sand martins out of the air on the wing. So keeping all that vegetation cut right back, even though it's over water, is seen as the way to remove the predators. Right. But also that Sand Martin cliff has got a specially designed void in the middle of it, which is full of bat roost features. And so we've actually got common and soprano pipistrelles in there already. So the bats took up residence almost immediately, and the Sand Martins are being far more sniffy about it.
Thank you. Okay. I haven't really got an enormous amounts of questions for you, James. Does anyone want to ask one by raising, by unmuting and asking directly? Sarah.
Thank you. Lovely talk, James. Thank you. I was just going to say, if the common pips, soprano pips have moved in, I think that counts as a real triumph. They're normally really snippy about where they go. So well done.
Excellent. Well, it was invented by Fraser, so he had a foot in both camps, mammals and birds.
Excellent work.
I like the calendar that Wild East Devon did last year with various people's contributions, yes, showing the wildlife and the reserves of East Devon, which opened my eyes to where you could go. I mean, I didn't know there was one so close to Exmouth either. I don't think you have anything to do with that.
Yeah, we've got, unfortunately, we missed out on doing one for this year because we've had a huge churn of staff in the team, and lots of people at the end of the pandemic left the team, and we've been rebuilding and scrambling to keep things going for the last sort of 6 months or so. But after Christmas, we've got a few new people who are about to join, and we settled things down in the autumn, and just getting to that point of feeling optimistic that, you know, those lovely but time-consuming things like pulling the photo competition together to make the calendar can get back into production again.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Do you have volunteers that help on the reserve?
Yeah, we've got a list of over 150 on our books at the moment, and we use a fabulous piece of software called 3 Rings, which was developed for volunteering databases. And so people can choose any variety of different roles that we've got, and then receive updates whenever those functions have got a slot that needs to be filled. So what we try and always maintain is that any work we get the volunteers doing is meaningful and has a legitimacy to it. We don't want to create work just to provide volunteering, but also we don't want to just ask volunteers to turn up and then have nothing really significant for them to do. So we've got our newest volunteer role is walking around providing information and hints and tips of where to go at the wetlands. So it's a completely non-physical engagement function. And then we've got a lot of people that just get stuck in with scrub bashing, where we do need to get rid of scrub, because I do have to have, you know, hat on, and sometimes we need less of it. A lot of the times we need more. Or working on our charcoal kiln and making local lumpwood charcoal. So there's all sorts of different things, from very, very physical to much less. And I think the next role that we're looking to launch is much more of a sort of administrative one. And we're looking for people who'd like to sort of join us to help with our events administration. So booking people on and updating websites and things like that. So even if people don't even want to leave the house, they can still help do their bit for people enjoying wildlife and nature.
Tara has asked, how do we sign up as a potential volunteer?
On the East Devon District Council website is a whole section of pages to the Countryside Team, and one of those pages is volunteering, with all the links on there. And it's an automated system where there's a Google sign up form, and then that populates you straight into our database.
Okay, so that's the East Devon District Council website.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's what was the section for?
The Countryside Team page.
The Countryside Team.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll just read you, James, a few comments because they've all been lovely. Really interesting talk from Kate and Andrew, especially about the beavers. That was good. And thank you from Simon and Lorraine, most enjoyable, and various positive comments. So thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. And Simon's just shared our volunteering page because he's computer literate and put it straight up there for us.
So where do we see that, Simon?
On the chat.
On the chat.
There's a hyperlink there.
Oh, thank you so much. That's great. Thanks, Simon. Do you have anything? Oh, it's probably not you because it's the National Trust, but in Exmouth we have the path leading down to the estuary with the tree planting and so forth. Do you link up with other organisations? We
did in Exmouth specifically. For the last 3 years, just came to an end in December last year. We were running the Wild Exmouth project that had a lot of partnership work in collaboration with Rob and his team down at Lower Holsden Farm. And we've slightly shifted one of our team members' job descriptions around, so she'll be able to continue the great work that was started there. Because the one thing that none of us wanted to do was come to the end of a 3-year, very expensively funded Heritage Lottery Fund project drop everything, walk away, and wander into the sunset and never to be seen again. So there's been lots of good stuff started, and then we'll be able to maintain some of it, not to the level we were able to under the project, but certainly we'll be keeping tabs on stuff with Lower Holsden, and also the Wild Exmouth recruits who volunteer within the town and get involved in project work on the local nature reserves there at the Mare and on the Exmouth, on the ex-estuary, and the Weasel Run, which is the most fabulous little bit of sort of old railway sidings, which just run up to a vantage point on the estuary.
Oh, thank you very much. Has everyone said what they wanted? Good. I can't see anybody desperate to talk.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yes, certainly.
On November the 12th, I was walking into Exmouth, going towards Lower Housden Farm, when I'm pretty certain a dormouse ran out across the cycle track. I was wondering if this was possible. It come up from the railway embankment where all the bramble was, saw me and then just run back again.
Wow. I mean, that would be very, very late in the season for a dormouse to still be active. Whether we were having a sort of little warm spell at that point and it had temporarily come out of hibernation and was desperately looking for some fuel to get it back to sleep. But sometimes some of the wood mice can be very, very ginger on their dorsal surface, their top side.
There's definitely
can look
a bushy tail, so that's
right. Yeah, well, I mean, bushy tail is very dormousey, very identifiable. So the one thing I've learned in, what is it now, 21, gosh, that's scary, 21 years of working in conservation, is never disregard anything. There's no absolutes at all. So yeah, if it was a small ginger rodent with a big bushy tail running across your path on the 12th of November, then sounds like a dormouse to me.
Thank you.
David has asked, does anybody know where the Woodland Trust are bidding for a site near Lympston? Yes, there was something on the news yesterday.
I can't remember the name of the farm, but they've secured quite a lot of land up there. But I've only been very arm's length involved. We've got fabulous new recruits in East Devon called Rory, who's the district ecologist. And so he'll be involved, and obviously our tree officer team will have some involvement as well. But obviously, being a completely self-contained charity project, we've really, our role is to sort of watch on from the sidelines and cheer them on. More power to their elbow. But I think.
Any idea where it is, James?
I can't remember the name of the farm. And I don't.
The village or? Oh, Simon has said up the X-View Road near
Coombe Solar Farm.
Ah, right.
But I don't know enough of the details of that project to even know whether there's going to be public access around the project site, or whether it'll be a closed site. I don't know.
I looked up on the Woodland Trust website to try and find out where it was, but it didn't give any exact details.
It's on the Woodland Rock. It's on the Woodland Rock.
The one thing I do know is that the charity could have picked any county to run this project in as part of their 50th anniversary celebrations, and chose Devon because it was Devon that their founder hailed from, and he was one of the founding members of Devon Wildlife Trust, and he drove a yellow Lamborghini, and I embarrassingly can't remember his name, but
Wow.
He kept on coming to the DWT trustees meetings with yet another woodland that he wanted the charity to buy, Andrews Wood and Dunsford and all those. And eventually one day one of the trustees said, Ray, you really should get your own charity and start one up dedicated to woodlands. And so that's what he did.
Ah, well, that sounds great. Thank you. Well, thank you, James. Sorry, I was looking at Simon's note. Thank you, James, so much.
That's a pleasure.
It's really good. And do keep us informed, won't you? Because it's lovely to know about these projects going on. And
Yes.
I think as part of the local group, it's good to link up with other local people and other local organisations. So thank you so much.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.